Hello, everyone. Enjoy these moments of relaxation as you watch. Gonzalo squeezed his wife's hand, leaning in closer. Are you sure you're okay? Rebecca nodded. Yes, I'm just ready. I feel like this pregnancy has lasted an eternity. Gonzalo smiled. You've been saying that since the 6th month. They chuckled softly, but behind this simple conversation, they both knew the real challenge was just beginning. This was labor, and no preparation or excitement could fully predict what was coming. That morning, when the contractions started regularly, Rebecca instinctively knew that the time had come. The rhythmic tightening in her belly, which had previously been sporadic, now came with a steady beat, like a countdown. The doctor had already warned her that this could happen anytime. Subscribe to the channel and click on the notification. Help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers. This way YouTube will deliver this content to more people who will benefit. I count on your help. After a quick call to the hospital, they gathered their things and drove there, their hearts racing in time with the hum of the car tires on the road. When they reached the maternity ward, it was relatively quiet. The nurses greeted them with practiced smiles, guiding them to a private room. Though the warmth in their expressions was genuine, Rebecca couldn't shake off the feeling of vulnerability of being a patient, despite being in a hospital run by her husband. She sat on the bed, adjusting her position as Gonzalo paced nearby, looking every bit the anxious father. I thought I'd be calmer than this, he admitted, running a hand through his neatly trimmed beard. I've seen hundreds of surgeries here, but this time it's different. Because this time it's personal. Rebecca smiled, placing a hand over her belly, feeling the familiar kick of her baby girl. We've waited for this moment for so long, and now it's finally here. Gonzalo leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. You're the strongest woman I know. You're going to do great. A light knock on the door interrupted their moment. A woman in her 40s entered, her blonde hair tied back in a neat bun, radiating professionalism and calm. Her uniform was crisp, and the badge read Elena. Her sharp blue eyes swept the room before resting on Rebecca. Good morning, Elena said with a pleasant but distant tone, like someone who's done this many times before. I'll be your nurse today. How are you feeling? Rebecca shifted slightly on the bed, bracing for the next contraction. I'm all right, but the contractions are getting stronger, she said, keeping her voice steady. Elena barely glanced at Rebecca while jotting something down on her clipboard. That's normal. First-time mothers often find the pain worse than it really is, but don't worry. We'll help you through this. Gonzalo stood close by, watching the nurse intently. There was something in her tone that bothered him, but he kept silent, not wanting to jump to conclusions too quickly. However, Rebecca couldn't help but feel a growing unease. She had heard many stories of women, especially women of color, whose pain was dismissed or ignored during labor. But that wouldn't happen here, not in Gonzalo's hospital. Another contraction came, stronger than before, and Rebecca clutched the sheet. Elena glanced up briefly, but said nothing. Rebecca tried to breathe through the pain, but the dull ache in her lower back was intensifying. I think I need to lie down, she murmured, her voice tight. Elena clicked her pen and adjusted the bed without much comment. It's still too early for any pain relief, she explained, but we'll keep monitoring your progress. Pain relief is typically used to numb the lower part of the body during labor, providing more effective relief. Let me know if anything changes. Then, Elena left the room, maintaining her professional distance. Rebecca lay back, staring at the ceiling. The contractions kept coming faster, and despite her efforts to stay calm, anxiety gnawed at her. She wanted to trust the nurses and doctors, but something in Elena's manner made her uneasy. Noticing the change in her expression, Gonzalo squeezed her hand again. Are you all right? Do you want me to call the nurse back? Rebecca shook her head, trying to smile. I'm okay. Just nervous. Gonzalo didn't fully understand what was going on in her mind, but he nodded, though his eyes still showed a flicker of doubt. We're in good hands, Rebecca. Let's focus on breathing. Rebecca tried to focus on that, on breathing, on the life growing inside her, on the joy they were anticipating. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She told herself she was probably overreacting. However, when another contraction came, even more intense than before, the tightness in her chest grew stronger. As time passed, Rebecca's initial contractions became increasingly intense. She shifted uncomfortably on the bed, trying to find a position that brought some relief, but the pain escalated more quickly than she had expected. Each contraction was stronger, like a relentless grip on her lower belly and back. Gonzalo remained by her side, holding her hand, though he, too, felt the tension in the air mounting. His comforting words began to falter, replaced by anxious glances toward the door where Elena had last disappeared after a previous check. Rebecca inhaled deeply, trying to exhale slowly as the next contraction hit like a speeding train. This time, she couldn't suppress the moan that escaped her lips. Gonzalo immediately leaned closer. "Are you sure you're okay? You don't look okay, sweetheart." Rebecca shook her head, beads of sweat forming on her forehead. "It's worse than I expected." "Much worse," she whispered, her voice quavering with pain and a rising fear that something wasn't right. Gonzalo stood up, determination hardening his features. "I'm calling the nurse." Rebecca watched as he hurried to the door, peering into the corridor. Moments later, Elena returned, clipboard in hand, a professional mask firmly in place. "Everything all right?" Elena asked, her voice lacking any warmth or genuine concern. "My wife is in a lot of pain," Gonzalo said, tension threading through his voice. "She says it's getting much worse. Can you please check her progress?" Elena nodded, though there was a hint of irritation in her voice as she replied. "Labor typically becomes more painful as it progresses. She's only been here a short while. First-time mothers often think the pain is worse than it really is." Rebecca gritted her teeth. She had felt real pain before. This wasn't an exaggeration. She felt different. She swallowed her frustration, trying to stay calm. "Could you please check?" Gonzalo insisted, his voice growing firmer. "Just to be sure." Elena sighed, setting aside her clipboard and donning a pair of gloves. "All right, I'll check." She performed the examination quickly, her expression impassive as she assessed Rebecca's dilation. After a moment, she stepped back, removing the gloves with a decisive motion. "You're only at 3 centimeters," she said flatly. "It's still a long way to go, and this could take hours. We'll check again later, but for now there's nothing to do but wait. Pain is just part of the process." Elena's words made Rebecca's heart sink. Hours? How could she endure this for many more hours when the pain was already so intense? A familiar knot tightened in her chest, and fear mingled with frustration with each wave of pain. "I don't think I can wait that long," Rebecca whispered, almost too softly to hear. "Something feels wrong. This isn't normal." Elena raised her eyebrows, unimpressed. "Every labor is different. You're doing fine. Just try to relax." Relax? How could she possibly relax when her body felt like it was being torn apart? Rebecca wondered. Gonzalo, sensing her unease, spoke again. "Is there really nothing we can do for her pain? Maybe some kind of medication?" Elena shook her head, her impatience barely hidden. "It's still too early for pain relief, and we don't want to slow down the labor with unnecessary interventions. Just give it more time." Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at Gonzalo, seeing the worry etched into his face. This wasn't just typical labor pain. She could feel it deep in her bones. Something was wrong, but no one seemed to be listening. As the minutes dragged on, the pain became nearly unbearable. Rebecca bit down hard, her hands gripping the edges of the bed as another contraction tore through her. Her breaths came in sharp, shallow gasps, her skin slick with sweat. Henry's voice broke through the haze of pain. "Rebecca, please tell me what's happening. You look like you're in so much pain." Yes, Rebecca managed between contractions. "It's very different. Very sharp, like something's tearing inside." Henry's face paled. He'd never seen Rebecca like this, and his own fear began to seep in. He glanced toward the door, where Elena had disappeared once again. "This isn't right," he muttered. "I'm getting the doctor." Without waiting for a response, Henry hurried out into the corridor. Rebecca could hear his voice down the hallway, his frustration clear. Moments later, Elena returned, her expression tight with annoyance. "We've already discussed this," she said, her tone dismissive. "I told you it's still too early for any serious concerns." Rebecca barely registered Elena's words as a wave of pain crashed over her like a relentless tide, drowning out everything else. She wanted to tell Elena that this wasn't normal, but her voice was smothered by the pain. Henry returned to her side, his hands trembling as he held hers. "The doctor is in surgery," he said softly. "They said he'll come as soon as possible." Rebecca nodded weakly, but her mind whirled with chaotic thoughts. What if the doctor didn't arrive in time? What if something terrible happened to her or the baby? Why wasn't anyone listening? Time blurred as Rebecca's contractions grew more violent and continuous, each one like a giant wave crashing against her. Her vision blurred with tears as she squeezed Henry's hand, her body shaking with pain. Each time she tried to speak, her words were swallowed by the agony. Henry stood by, helpless. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked again toward the door, gritting his teeth. "I don't care what she says," he muttered. "Something's wrong. I'm getting the doctor out of surgery." Before Henry could leave, a different nurse entered the room, her face showing more empathy than Elena's. She quickly checked Rebecca's monitors, her brow furrowing as she looked at the readings. "I'm calling for backup," she said firmly. "Hang in there. We're going to take care of you." For the first time in what felt like hours, Rebecca felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone was paying attention. But before the new nurse could leave the room, Elena reappeared, her expression irritated. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice brimming with frustration. "I'm in charge here." The new nurse hesitated, glancing back at the monitors. "Her vitals are dropping. We need to act now." Elena crossed her arms, her face hardening. "I've been with this patient since she arrived. She's fine. We don't need to overreact just because she's uncomfortable." Henry's anger finally boiled over. "Uncomfortable," he snapped, his voice shaking with fury. "My wife is in severe pain, and you've ignored her this whole time. If you don't call someone now, you'll lose your job." Elena opened her mouth to argue, but the new nurse was already on the phone. "I'm calling the doctor," she said firmly. "We're not taking any chances." As the nurse made the call, Elena shot Henry a glare before leaving the room. Rebecca barely noticed, too focused on the sound of her own racing heartbeat and the growing sense that something terrible was about to happen. Rebecca felt her body start to give out, as if it no longer belonged to her. The contractions weren't just painful, they were brutal, each one ripping through her with a ferocity that left her breathless, unable to think. Her vision blurred, and she felt cold sweat trickling down her skin. Henry's voice was now just a distant hum, but she couldn't make out the words. All she felt was the relentless, crushing pain, an overwhelming force she couldn't fight against. "Henry," Rebecca gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Something's really wrong." Henry's face was ashen, filled with worry. He leaned closer, his eyes wide with fear. "I know, Rebecca, I know. I'm getting help now." Rebecca felt her grip weaken on his hand, her fingers cold and shaking. Panic surged as her body seemed to shut down. She couldn't pass out, she told herself. She couldn't lose control. She had to stay awake for herself and for the baby. But her body seemed to be giving out, and no one seemed to be doing anything to stop it. The new nurse, who had sensed something was wrong, moved quickly, adjusting the monitors and keeping her eyes fixed on the numbers and graphs. Concern deepened on her face as she spoke. "Her pressure's dropping. We need the doctor now." Henry shot to his feet, pacing back and forth in the room, his face a mask of helpless rage. "Where's the doctor?" he growled. "She's getting worse." Rebecca let out a low moan, her hand instinctively reaching for her belly as another excruciating contraction hit. But this time, it wasn't just pain. It was a sharp, tearing sensation, and a heavy pressure pulled from deep inside her. Rebecca's heart pounded in her ears as a terrifying thought gripped her. The baby. What was happening to the baby? She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her vision started to narrow, as if the light around her was fading. Just then, the door swung open, and Dr. Howard rushed into the room, his expression steely with professional focus. He still wore his surgical cap, as if he'd just come straight from the operating room. Without a word, he quickly assessed the scene, the weak vitals on the monitors, the panic on Henry's face, and the desperate look in Rebecca's eyes. "We need to stabilize her," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Prep or for an emergency C-section." Henry stepped forward, fists clenched at his sides. "What's happening to her? What's wrong?" Dr. Howard met Henry's eyes for a brief moment. "She's in danger. The baby is too. We don't have time to waste. We need to operate now." Henry held his breath, but before he could respond, Elena returned, her face pinched with frustration. "I don't think this is necessary," she said tightly. "She's only been here a few hours. It's her first baby. These things take time." Rebecca, her head swimming with pain and fear, barely heard Elena's voice. But Henry's reaction was immediate. He turned to face her, his expression burning with an intensity Rebecca had never seen before. "Are you serious?" Henry's voice was low but trembled with barely controlled anger. My wife is on the brink of collapse, and you're downplaying her pain. She's not an inconvenience. She's a person, a mother, and you're ignoring her. Elena seemed taken aback by the accusation but tried to keep her composure, straightening her shoulders. I'm just following procedures, she replied coolly. First-time mothers often. Don't you dare finish that sentence, Henry interrupted, standing up sharply. Don't you dare blame my wife for this. She told you something was wrong, and you ignored her. Rebecca flinched at the intensity in Henry's voice. It was all true. She had been ignored, dismissed until it was almost too late. She cast a glance toward the door, not a plea, but a silent resolve. She knew it was time for consequences. Dr. Howard's voice cut through the tension. That's enough, Elena. Leave the room. No. Elena's mouth opened as if to protest, but Dr. Howard's tone left no room for argument. You put this patient's life at risk by not listening when she needed help. You need to go before you make things worse. Elena's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but she turned sharply and left the room without another word. As soon as the door clicked shut, the atmosphere in the room seemed to lift slightly, though the anger lingered like a heavy cloud. Dr. Howard turned back to Rebecca and Henry, his expression softening. I'm so sorry for what you've been through, he said quietly. What happened here today is unacceptable. You shouldn't have to fight to be heard. Rebecca felt tears welling up again. Thank you, she whispered, her voice cracking. Thank you for saving us. Dr. Howard nodded. We'll be reviewing everything that happened today. I promise you, we won't let this happen again. Henry, still standing, took a deep breath and nodded. We'll follow up closely, he said firmly. This can't be swept under the rug. It won't be, Dr. Howard assured them. We'll make sure of that. With that, the doctor excused himself, leaving Rebecca and Henry alone. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything that had happened still hanging over them. Rebecca looked down at her daughter, now sleeping peacefully in her arms, a quiet contrast to the chaos of her birth. We made it, Rebecca whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. We got through it. Henry sat beside her, his gaze softening as he looked at their daughter. Yes, we did, he said quietly. Though they wanted to rest in the relief of being together as a family, they both knew that their ordeal wasn't over. Elena's negligence wasn't just a personal failure, it was a symptom of a larger issue. And while Rebecca and Henry had been fortunate to survive, others might not be as lucky. We can't let this happen to anyone else, Henry said softly, resting a hand on Rebecca's shoulder. Rebecca nodded, her eyes still fixed on her daughter. We'll make sure it doesn't, she whispered. 2 days had passed since Rebecca's emergency C-section. The trauma of the experience still lingered. Rebecca sat up in bed, holding her daughter as sunlight streamed through the hospital window. Her body was beginning to heal, but the emotional wounds, the fear and anger, were still fresh. Henry had been by her side the whole time, but his mind was elsewhere. In the past 48 hours, he had quietly but determinedly demanded answers from the hospital's administration. Rebecca knew how much this meant to him, not just as her husband, but as the hospital's director. He wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting for change in a broken system. That afternoon, Henry received the call he had been waiting for. The hospital's CEO, along with Dr. Howard and the head of human resources, wanted to meet with them to discuss the investigation's findings. Henry clenched his jaw as he ended the call, but there was a quiet resolve in his eyes. They're ready, he said softly, sitting beside Rebecca and gently stroking their daughter's head. They're going to give us the report. Rebecca's heart raced. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the moment when everything that had happened would be acknowledged. But now it wasn't just about Elena. It was about ensuring that no one else had to fight for their own life like she had. An hour later, Rebecca and Henry were escorted to the hospital's conference room. It was a somber space, with a long table, neatly arranged chairs, and the quiet hum of the air conditioning in the background. Dr. Howard was already seated beside the CEO, Michael, a man Henry had known for years. There were no greetings or small talk. The atmosphere was tense and serious. Thank you for coming, Michael began, his voice calm but strained. I want to start by offering our deepest apologies for what happened to Rebecca during labor. We've reviewed the entire case, and I assure you, we are treating this with the utmost seriousness. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at Henry, who sat stiffly, silent with an unreadable expression. Dr. Howard leaned forward and spoke next. Rebecca, Henry, the hospital's internal investigation confirmed our concerns. Elena's actions during Rebecca's labor were negligent. She failed to report Rebecca's condition when necessary, dismissed her pain, and made decisions that could have cost both mother and child their lives. Rebecca swallowed hard, gripping Henry's hand tighter. She had known it, felt it deep down, but hearing the confirmation brought a fresh wave of emotion. Elena has been placed on indefinite suspension, Michael continued, his voice heavy. She will no longer work here, and depending on the final outcome of our legal review, she may face further consequences, including the revocation of her license. Henry's voice, firm and controlled, cut in. This isn't just about one nurse. It's a systemic issue. Patients, especially women of color, are not being listened to or treated fairly. Michael nodded slowly, as if weighing each word. We recognize the scope of the problem, Henry. We know this isn't an isolated incident, and change is necessary. That's why we're immediately implementing mandatory bias training for all staff, along with a new protocol for addressing patient concerns, especially regarding pain management during labor. We will also establish a task force to monitor accountability in all departments. Henry's expression softened slightly, though the intensity remained in his eyes. It's a start, he said quietly. But this can't just be policy on paper. It needs to be real change. Michael nodded again. Agreed, and I'm going to need your help, Henry, to lead this change. This is your hospital, too, and you've always been a voice for progress here. We need that voice now more than ever. Henry sighed, looking at Rebecca, who remained silent throughout the meeting. She squeezed his hand, giving a small nod of encouragement. They had fought this battle together, and though the scars were still fresh, the acknowledgement of the problem and the steps to fix it felt like a victory. A few days later, the hospital officially announced Elena's termination. The internal review moved quickly, and the hospital issued a public statement detailing the steps being taken to address bias within the institution. The message was clear. What happened to Rebecca was unacceptable, and they were committed to ensuring it wouldn't happen to anyone else. Rebecca read the statement as she lay in her hospital bed, her feelings a mix of relief, anger, and lingering sadness. Elena had been dismissed, yes, but it didn't erase the fear she had felt during those critical moments. It didn't lessen the pain of being ignored when she knew something was wrong. But alongside that, there was hope. The hospital was changing, and Henry had begun working with the leadership to reform staff training and procedures. The issue of racial bias in healthcare was finally being brought into the light. Rebecca knew that her voice, her fight, had sparked this change, not just for herself but for future patients who might face similar discrimination. Holding her daughter close, Rebecca felt a new strength rising within her. She had always known the world wasn't perfect, that biases existed even in places where they shouldn't. But now she had the power to help change that, alongside Henry and those who truly cared about making a difference. On the morning they prepared to leave the hospital, Rebecca and Henry were ready to head home with their newborn daughter. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. Rebecca carefully dressed their daughter in a soft pink outfit, as the baby's tiny fingers curled around her own. Henry was quiet, his focus unpacking their bags, but Rebecca could sense the emotions welling up inside him. He had been strong throughout the ordeal, but now, as they were about to leave, the weight of what they had experienced was settling in. "Are you okay?" Rebecca asked softly, cradling their daughter as she sat on the edge of the bed. Henry looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "I am now," he said quietly, "but I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if Dr. Howard hadn't gotten there in time." Rebecca reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "But he did, and we're here. We're leaving together as a family." Henry nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're right. We made it through." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the room, a new nurse entered, offering them a warm smile. She looked down at their daughter with a gentle expression. "She's beautiful," the nurse said. "Congratulations to you both." "Thank you," Rebecca replied, her voice soft but steady. As they walked through the hospital corridors, Rebecca couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened, the fear, the fight for survival, and the strength she had needed to be heard. But now, with her daughter in her arms and Henry by her side, she felt empowered. She had faced injustice, and her voice had made a difference. When they reached the hospital exit, the sliding doors opened with a soft whoosh, and the morning light shone brightly outside. Rebecca took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air and the freedom she hadn't felt since they had arrived. Henry wrapped an arm around her shoulders as they stepped out, their daughter nestled between them. Ready to go home? He asked softly. Rebecca smiled, her heart fuller than ever. They stepped out together, leaving behind the fear and pain but carrying with them the strength they had found in each other. They were starting a new chapter, a chapter filled with love, hope, and the knowledge that they had made a difference. And as they looked at their small, perfect daughter in Rebecca's arms, they knew that the fight for justice didn't end there. They had stood up, and they would continue to fight for a world where every voice was heard, where no one was ignored, and where love and compassion triumphed over prejudice. Rebecca and Henry stepped out of the hospital into a world that felt both familiar and profoundly changed. The warm sunlight wrapped around them like a promise of new beginnings, and as they walked towards their car, each step felt lighter, carrying with it the relief of survival and the hope of change. Henry gently placed their daughter in her car seat, taking a moment to brush a fingertip over her tiny hand, marveling at her innocence. Rebecca watched him, heart swelling with love for the family they had fought so hard to protect. The baby let out a soft sigh, settling into sleep, and Rebecca couldn't help but smile, feeling the weight of the past few days slowly lifting. They drove home in a shared silence, each lost in their thoughts but feeling the comfort of each other's presence. The city streets passed by, familiar yet somehow transformed, just as they were, no longer just parents-to-be, but now guardians of a fragile new life and bearers of a renewed sense of purpose. As they pulled into their driveway, the house that once seemed like a simple home now felt like a sanctuary. Henry turned off the engine, and they sat for a moment, listening to the gentle breathing of their daughter. He turned to Rebecca, his expression softening as he reached for her hand. "We're really home," he said quietly, his voice tinged with wonder. Rebecca nodded, her eyes misty with emotion. "We made it," she replied, her voice catching on the words. "And we're going to make sure that what happened to us makes a difference." They carried their daughter inside, the weight of her small body feeling like a precious gift. The quiet of their home enveloped them, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. As they laid their baby down in her crib, they watched her tiny chest rise and fall, each breath a reminder of their victory against the odds. Rebecca leaned against Henry, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder. They had faced fear, pain, and injustice, but they had emerged stronger, determined to change the world for their daughter and for those who would come after her. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the warmth of their home and the soft glow of the afternoon sun streaming through the window, they made a silent promise to each other and to their newborn child, a promise of a future filled with love, strength, and unwavering commitment to a better world. Subscribe to the channel and click on the notification. Help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers. This way YouTube will deliver this content to more people who will benefit. I count on your help. And as they stood together, holding on to each other and the hope they now carried, they knew that their journey was far from over. But for the first time in days, they allowed themselves to savor the peace of the present, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it as a family.